Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending our Questline webinar, Diversity and Inclusion, Strategies for Energy Utilities. My name is Maureen Murky, and I'm the technical producer of today's webinar. Before we begin, we want to cover a few housekeeping items. To the left of your screen are multiple application widgets you can use. Most of the widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most of your desktop space. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A widget, which is directly below the presentation window. We will try to answer all questions during the webcast, but if a more in-depth answer is needed or we run out of time, they will be answered later via email. Some networks may cause sites to advance more slowly than others, so logging off your VPN is recommended. If your sites do fall behind, pushing F5 on your keyboard will refresh the page. If you do experience any other disruptions during the broadcast, please use the Q&A widget for any technical questions. We will be sending everyone a follow-up email within the next few days, which will include a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation and the playback link to the recording of today's webinar. We will also be conducting poll questions during the presentation and would greatly appreciate your participation. Please be aware that you are not the only participant today. The names of the other attendees are not being shown to you for privacy. Now, to get things started, Brian Lindemood, AVP of Marketing and Content Strategy, would like to welcome you on behalf of Questline.
Thank you, Maureen, and thanks to all of you for joining us today for this important conversation. The topic of racial justice and equality has taken on renewed importance this year with a national dialogue that was long overdue. For energy utilities, this issue is critical, not just as large employers, but as institutions in your communities and in the way you serve and represent your customers. Questline works with energy utilities to build customer engagement through content marketing and communication strategies. But to be effective, it's vital for those strategies to be inclusive, to connect with your diverse customers, just as it's critical for utilities and all businesses to make diversity a priority in hiring and in professional development. We're grateful for today's guests and the experience they bring to this conversation. Along with all of you, I'm looking forward to learning from their insight. To start that conversation, I will now turn it over to Mike Carter, Questline Senior Energy Analyst and our host for today's webinar.
With 170 utility technology company. Let me make sure I'm unmuted. I think I'm unmuted. SECC is an industry leader in consumer engagement with 170 utility technology company and consumer advocate members. SECC's research is often cited in regulatory proceedings and energy trade media. SECC also educates consumers directly about energy. Patty has a bachelor's degree in business and an MBA from the College of William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Kay Fuhrman is a partner in the industrial practice and leader of Heidrick Struggles Power and Utilities practice. Prior to joining Heidrick Struggles, Kay serves as Vice President of Business Development for Alliance Data, where she led large-scale business process and IT outsourcing transactions and systems integrations engagements with power, gas, water utilities, as well as energy retail and energy wholesale providers, ISO RTO operators, and independent power producers across North America. Kay holds an MBA from the University of Dayton. She also holds a BS in Business Administration from Wright State University. Sara Oliver Carter is the Chief Diversity Officer at Duquesne Light Company. She collaborates directly with the executive team to build out the company's diversity and inclusion strategy and the associated initiatives with a strong focus on talent acquisition, culture, community partnerships, and workplace inclusion and belonging. Prior to joining DLC in 2019, Sara was the Senior Director of Talent, Diversity, and Inclusion for Pennsylvania State University. Sara has a bachelor's degree in business communication and a master's of science degree in professional leadership from Carlow University. Now let's take a look at our agenda for today. We're going to start off looking at research on low-income customers and the smart energy future, as well as diversity and energy efficiency jobs. Next, we're going to learn the ABCs of diversity best practices. Then we'll be introduced to the strategic formula and guiding principles one utility is implementing to achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion. And at the end, we'll be taking your questions, so be ready to enter those in the Q&A text box at any time. And then interspersed throughout today's presentation, we'll also be launching poll questions and sharing your responses. So, Patty Durand, take control and launch our first poll for today.
Great. So you can launch the poll, Mike. I can talk to it. All right. So let's start out by asking you a question before we present any key details or data to you. And then we'll end with a poll at my presentation to see what you think and of what we've learned so far. So let me ask this. What is the best way that utilities and clean tech companies can increase diversity within their companies? Is it one, engage people from underrepresented groups with internship programs? Is it two, to focus on supplier diversity and inclusive procurement? 3, create clean energy opportunity zones in low-income communities? Or 4, partner with HBCUs, which stands for Historically Black Colleges and Universities, for energy-focused workshops and training programs to reach a more diverse pool of potential employees. So I'll give you a few seconds to select that answer that you think. All right, let's see some results. Number 1. Wow, most of you picked number 1. Engaging people from underrepresented groups with internship programs. By far the highest choice. And that sounds good. There's really no right answer. Actually, all of these could be choices that a company makes. But I agree with those of you that selected number 1. That's probably the best choice. So let's move on to the next slide. Here we go. So before we talk about the issue at hand, let me just tell you a second about who we are. We are a national nonprofit focused on consumers in energy and technology. And this is a subset of our members. We have over 170 members, as Mike said, many utilities, including Duquesne Light, the utility that will be presenting their program today. And what we do is we focus on consumers by listening to them directly through focus groups, through surveys, through online surveys, and televised or rather videoed meetings. And we ask them questions directly about their views on energy, technology, their utility, electricity, programs and services, and anything to do with energy. And then we package that into research studies. We also do a lot of educational work with consumers directly through infographics, social media, and websites. And we also educate stakeholders in the energy space through things like webinars like this, through the research studies, and through in-person events. So collaboration is in our name. It's a very important part of what we do. So we help bring different stakeholders together, all of whom interact with consumers and have a different view, and get on the same page with them as we go. So this is a snapshot of the last 5 studies that we've done. You can see that we've done a study on data analytics and how customers' pain points can be resolved through data. And we did a deep dive on low-income consumers, and we did a segmentation framework for small, medium businesses. What do they want about energy? What do they care about energy? And things like that. But what we'll focus on today is a little bit, well, let me just say that on the next slide, we are doing new research on lower income customers. I should say past tense, we've done it. It published last month, this study that you see the cover shot of. We published it last month. It's a deep dive on how they're being affected by the pandemic, what programs and services are being offered to them. And then in January, you can see the very bottom line on this slide that we are doing a study on racial disparities in energy. Prior to the Black Lives Matter movement this summer, we had not thought to address this issue, but like Questline, like just about every organization there is, we've stepped back and taken a look at systemic racism, racial justice, and since our space is energy, we're looking into that with energy from the data that we've already captured, that we published. We went back through and are doing a study on how do people of color answer these same questions differently than the majority population. And we did find quite a lot of disparity, and so that will be published in January. But for today, what we're going to focus on is diversifying the workforce. And so the energy efficiency sector, in terms of employees, is the largest part of the clean technology sector by far. But the problem is that people of color and marginalized communities aren't benefiting equally. They tend to be employed in much lower numbers and are often not trained, not engaged, and not paid the same. And so what you see on this screenshot is a study that was published by ACEEE in October, a very new study, that talks about how to expand opportunity to low-income or marginalized communities through energy efficiency jobs. And the study offers some great programs and ideas. And actually, there's more than that one. That's the one I'm highlighting for you today. But there are at least 4 other studies that have come out over the summer and fall that I'm happy to share with you if you would like. Some of the findings from this study include the 2 that I've highlighted here. There are certainly more. Those 2 include engaging people from underrepresented groups with training and internship programs. So that's exactly the first item in the poll that you answered. So maybe everyone read the study, I don't know. But certainly targeted internships and race-conscious outreach efforts is needed at this point. And so focusing on supplier diversity and inclusive procurement was another item on the poll, and is another key strategy, making sure that Black-owned businesses or Hispanic businesses or female-owned businesses are given opportunities to participate and compete in internships or in jobs and job placement for their people. So I want to highlight this really great program. You'll hear from Duquesne Light on their program. There's many programs. This great program was highlighted in the study from Ameren. They call it the Market Development Initiative, or MDI. And this program has done a lot. It's a great illustrative example of how to reach people of color or women in their community, what they exactly did. So their goals were to engage customers not previously benefited, increasing jobs available to local and diverse candidates, and support or grow new energy efficiency business. And those are the high-level goals. And now I'll show you this graphic. It might be a little difficult to read, but the thing I like about it is that it shows the details. And there's so many times that I'll see a program that is being offered by a utility that does not offer numbers. And so when they offer numbers, I really like to jump on it. And you can see here the numbers of people that they've employed, how they've spent their money, who's participated, how many jobs they've offered, and they show it as a roadmap. And I really like that presentation, and I like numbers, and it's a very successful program by all accounts. And then I also want to move on to this article. So there have been a lot of news. There have been a lot of webinars. Mostly the webinars have focused on energy costs to people of color. Bills are higher in communities of color. This webinar is unique, and I really thrilled to participate because is focusing on jobs and inclusion in the industry. And so what I want to share with this slide is that from my perspective, it seems that the energy is rising, the energy industry is rising to the call to increase diversity and to do more to reach out. You can see that in the middle bullet that the solar industry tends to be very heavily white, with white executives, white employees, and they are making a very big contribution to that. And you can see the quote from Paula Glover, the American Association of Blacks in Energy, basically saying that there's been a lot of calls to end racism, but not enough done about it. And that's a very great quote. So you can see here that they are working on it. They're aware of it. There's studies that show, like for instance, the last bullet, Black and Hispanic majority neighborhoods have installed less rooftop solar than white majority areas, even in the same income. So there's progress being made from the numbers. You can't fix something that's not measured. And so they've got it measured. And there are many studies that show the rooftop solar industry is beginning to change their outreach efforts. And some of the inclusion initiatives include more than people of color, includes veterans, it includes previously incarcerated people, it includes disabled people. And so I'm really hopeful that we're at a new day and new age where the energy industry is focused on inclusion and not just going on with business as usual. And I think our research that's coming in January is going to add a big new canon of knowledge, because it's going to focus on the ratepayer. It'll focus on the consumer and the disparities there. So between the jobs focus and the ratepayer focus, I'm really excited that this is a new day. I'd like to end with this information that shows that the conversation continues. We're doing a lot with diversity, inclusion, and racial disparity work. Some of that work, really all that work, is online. We have conversations on LinkedIn, conversations on Twitter. You can see our Twitter followers are about 10,000, which is among the highest in the industry. And we post snippets of our findings. There'll be a lot there about racial disparities on LinkedIn and Twitter, so I encourage you to follow us. And I look forward to conversation after these presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. And if anyone has any questions about what Patty shared with us, please type those in the Q&A text box, and we'll be addressing those questions at the end. So our next poll question, as shown here, is what's the top reason for the historically high energy burden in communities of color? There are 4 choices for you. Pick the one that you think is the top reason for that high energy burden. And we'll share those results here in just a second as you jump in on that and give your vote. What do you think is the top reason for the historically high energy burden in communities of color? Is it lack of infrastructure, programming investments, that practice of redlining, or just poor quality housing stock? So appreciate your participation on polls today. We're going to have a couple more before the end of the session today, and it's always helpful to get your feedback and see what you're thinking about issues that we're presenting with you today. So looks like we have a number of people answering, so I'm going to go ahead and share that. So pretty diverse here, spread between that lack of energy infrastructure and poor quality housing start probably to begin with. And some of you thought that the practice of redline was still making an effect as well. So appreciate your participation in that. And with that, let's hear from Kay Fuhrman on what I call the ABCs of diversity best practices. Kay, why don't you go ahead and take control of the presentation? Okay, I think you're still muted, so check the mute button there.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm Kay Fuhrman. I'm a partner with Heidrick Struggles. Heidrick is a 70-year-old leadership advisory and executive search firm. We work globally across industries and all around the world. I'm based in Dallas, and I lead our power and utilities practice for the firm. The work that we do is partnering with great companies across the power and utilities industry and the infrastructure and technology providers and services that support the industry to help think through topical issues regarding talent and leadership. Diversity and inclusion has, of course, as has already been noted, been a topic that's been brought to the thrust to the forefront of the discussion over the past 6 to 9 months. And all organizations that we have dealt with are grappling with it. You read about it, you hear about it, and you're all thinking about it. When we look at the business case, if you will, for diversity, it starts with a world that's changing fast, and we can see some highlights here on this slide that really focus on the very interesting dynamic of the number of women that are the customers making purchasing decisions on behalf of their household, and the disparity of that between the number of women sitting in the C-suite. Same is true with respect to people of color. When you look at the fact that of the job growth happening globally, 120% of that is being capitalized on, and people of color represent 120% of that job growth, yet they make up only 13% of the executive leadership teams in the US and the UK. Also, the last statistic there is particularly interesting. By 2030, 50% of the world's graduates will be from China and India, while only 8% from the United States. I think it's a really interesting statistic that's just talking about the demographics that are feeding the diversity and inclusion story. When we look at the business case for diversity and inclusion, we've seen and heard many of these statistics before. The couple that really stood out to me are, first of all, on the right-hand side there, 48% is the level of financial outperformance for executive teams with 30% women. The other that really stuck out to me, all of these are significant, is the lower right corner. 6 times more likely to be an innovative and agile as an organization if diversity and inclusion is a core part of how the business is run. It's an assumed point of that we all conclude. However, we are still on a journey as organizations to achieve it. So when we look at the next slide, is a bit of a continuum. And all organizations are on this continuum at some point or another. What we have found is over the last 3 to 5 years, most organizations, the vast majority, are somewhere between number 2 and number 3 on this continuum, between supportive and engaged. Supportive are those companies that are focused on recruiting and supporting various underrepresented groups, women, people of color, and other underrepresented groups, LGBTQ+, and so on. They do that through employee resource groups and other focused initiatives to create and bring in more people into the organization from those groups. Or many companies, especially today with the spotlight on us, on the subject, are clearly in the engaged category. There's a growing awareness, and the concept of diversity and inclusion is embedded in the values that employees live by and think about. So that engaged level is one where many companies today sit. They've invested, they've paid attention to it, they've focused, and they consider it core to their values. However, over the past 6 months, with all that's occurred and the elevation of the awareness, there's a clear change that is driving organizations to run as quickly as they can toward the change agent category, to really step up the efforts in minimum or table stakes relative to how an organization performs in the market. Utilities are among those. A change agent is really one organization that has a deep understanding of what it takes to make inclusion happen and can inspire and effectively communicate to all of the stakeholders, internally to employees, externally to stakeholders, including customers and investors, and so on. So organizations are trying to run as fast as they can toward that status. There are some companies that have been there and are approaching that level that use diversity as a strength for their business to attract, retain. They're talent magnets really in the marketplace, but they are few and far between. So there's a lot to learn from the companies that sit there. Through our work with organizations across industries, we've found that these organizations at that change agent level and above really apply best practices that we can set out as kind of 3 pieces of a DE&I puzzle. We call it the ABCs. A is accelerate. Accelerate for DE&I impact and results. B, build visible representation. And C, create an inclusive culture. It's interesting because as Patty was talking just a bit ago, we heard and saw a number of these things take shape in her example around what Ameren's doing. And you'll hear about the same when Sara speaks in a few minutes about what's happening at Duquesne, maybe happening at some level in each of your organizations. It's doing the diagnostic, knowing what you've got today, where you are today, producing and thinking through, defining those aspirations and the strategy around how the company is going to approach D&I and DE&I equity. Build that roadmap. It was a beautiful graphic that Patty included earlier, and that roadmap structure exists in organizations on this journey. You have to have the path that you're going to follow, measure it, really produce the numbers, think about how it's resulting in impact within the organization, and commit to it. Commit from the top and all the way through. That builds the foundation. It's supplemented by and creates really life and lives on in an organization when you build that visible representation. That happens both through attracting and onboarding diverse talent, creating a pipeline that may be the leaders of the future that you're bringing in at all levels, not only at the very top, but across the organization. And then thinking about that process to recruit. When you're recruiting diverse talent is advantaged when it is a diverse group of people that candidate meets and gets to know. Onboarding, thinking about how do you onboard and how do you accelerate a newly joined diverse team member. And then developing that internal talent through assessment, succession planning, coaching, and really continuing to create opportunities for development. And then all of that is wrapped with a diverse and inclusive culture. It starts from the top. Again, you have to measure it. As Patty said, if you don't measure it, it's tough to truly impact change. And really focus on starting at the very top and cascading through the organization to ensure that the culture is embraced and supported all the way up and down. And that helps when there's an online or available toolkit that helps knit together the values, the roadmap, the strategy, the people to feel included and engaged. And when we think about this, this is all a way to wrap it together. So I'm sure we'll hear more about this when Sara speaks in a moment, but Mike, back over to you.
A question in your mind, and go ahead and type that in the Q&A text box, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So our next, oops. I appreciate that, Kay. And if anyone has a question prompted about Kay shared, then type that in the Q&A text box. So our next poll question is here. It's really leveraging what Kay shared about the 5-point scale, and where does your company fall on this scale? She showed a 5-point scale starting from unaware to compliant, supportive, engaged, change agents, and able to leverage diversity. So let's know where you think your energy company is at in its commitment to achieving diversity on this scale. We'll give you just a couple minutes here, or a couple seconds more here to jump on that. Really appreciate your participation. Are you at the unaware stage, or are you all the way to the able to leverage diversity? We'll take a look at the results here in just a second. Several of you have jumped on that, and I appreciate that. So let's go ahead and take a look at what everyone rated their company as here. And we see that quite a few of you feel that you are engaged, some supportive and compliant, some of you as far as being a change agent. So that's very good. And we applaud you for that and appreciate what your company is accomplishing. So now, Sara Oliver Carter is going to give us an inside look at DE&I efforts at Duquesne Light Company. So Sara, go ahead and take control.
All right, thank you, Mike. So welcome again. Excited to be here with this esteemed panel. We're going to talk about all of the things that Patty and Kay talked about. I'm actually going to show to you in action. So there's one slide that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on, a little bit more than the others, but feel free to ask questions later. So again, as Mike said, my name is Sara Oliver Carter, and I am the Chief Diversity Officer for Duquesne Light. And there we focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm just going to call your attention to what our CEO said, because it's something that Patty and Kay both brought up, which is sponsorship. Having sponsorship at the very top when you start your DE&I journey. All right. So about Duquesne Light. So I want to share a little bit about who we are, what we do, and then to the right of the slide, not only are we committed to DE&I, but some of the things we've accomplished through all of the things that Patty and Kay have talked about. So Duquesne Light Company is a next generation energy company. We serve about 500,000 plus consumers, which is exciting, with 1,600 employees. And that's been for about the past 140 years. Duquesne Light has been a proud partner in the Pittsburgh region. So we have about 2 counties that we cover. And, you know, we're very excited about serving that particular group. What I also want to pull your attention to is we are very much aware of the diversity of our consumers and our customers and our employees, and why that is critical to the success of Duquesne Light. So I'm going to pull you over to the right of the slide. And again, we always talk about part of the journey is commitment. We heard that from Patty, we heard that from Kay. We saw the maturity model that Kay shared, and we determined, you know, where organizations are, but commitment is critical, right? And one of the things I'm going to just read here is we deliver on our commitment to attract, retain highly skilled talent that is reflective, this is key, reflective of the communities that we serve, right? So one of the things that we've launched recently is a new campaign building a new table together. And that's what we call inclusion. Like you can bring groups of people to the table, but they have to have a seat. So we're creating the table, we're creating the seat, and we're creating that level of inclusion. And when we do that, this is what we've accomplished. We've created in 12 months, we've launched and started business employee resource groups, and those are employee affinity groups, if you will. We have a full DE&I strategy for the next 3 to 5 years. We've created a driving change platform. This is the thing, and I think both Patty and Kay talked about it. Due to the current civil unrest, we have to learn to have those candid conversations. This is critical. And then we've created a program where we're supporting, and I think Patty talked a lot about this, was supplier diversity, where we are supporting Black-owned businesses in the community. So I'm going to tell you how we got there. All right, so this is what it's kind of been touched on earlier. We had to build out. So you can, let me reframe that. You can just jump into this D&I thing and you can kind of get it started. I would invite you to think about the fact that you pretty much want to start and build out a strategy, right? What I've learned pretty quickly in my career is culture eats strategy for lunch every single day. So how do we get there? What do we do? What was our approach? So again, I'm going to go back to Patty's research, what Kay talked about in terms of executive sponsorship. We built executive sponsorship with our leaders. They sponsored the program. There was a cascading effect that happened, and it started to push the message down. And then we had an approach that we built out. And it's related to the ADDIE model, which if anyone's familiar with that, that's like talent management. The very first thing we did was assess the situation. And then you go to number 3, we defined it. What is it? So we've talked about like diversity, equity, and inclusion. What we found during our journey is not everybody understood what those terms meant. And we needed to have a common language. So when we talk about diversity, we're not just talking about race, gender, ethnicity, orientation. We talk about who you are individually, how you learn, where you live, what your positional power is or not, right? We talk about all those things. Inclusion is being invited and encouraged to participate. And equity is equal opportunity. But equal opportunity is not the same for every individual. So we had to think about that. And then you did exactly what we did, which is, where are we in this? What is our current state? Where do we want to be aspirationally, right? And so we mapped that out. And I'm actually going to show you where we mapped out our strategy in terms of, okay, this is where DLC is, or Duquesne Light is right now. And future state, there are places that we definitely want to be leading and places that we want to be pushing the envelope. Once we decided these things, and then we knew we needed to align our diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy with a company strategy. DE&I is part of what makes an organization successful, right? So you align it. You ensure that all of the activities, all of the initiatives, all of the plans, strategies align with the overarching organizational strategy. And then there's this small thing called change management. We talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. It is change. So we incorporated a change management, and we saw in there, and I think Patty and both Kay talked about change agents, change sponsors, right? Who are our targets when we're doing this change? How are we helping people move through what you call the change curve? Because you're going to have some people that are kind of like, I'm not so interested. There's some folks that are gung-ho and just really kind of want to, move through, and others that are like, what's in it for me? That's the other thing we had to define as we move through this process, is the wisdom in it for each individual in the organization. Why is it that this matters to you? Whether it's the business outcome, whether it's the opportunity for innovation, right? Whether it's the opportunity to just have your voice heard. That is a strategy that we used at Duquesne Light to get to where we are today. And quite frankly, we were pretty aggressive with it. So what did that result in? Well, and again, you can see this, design and determine. One of the things that we felt like we needed were guiding principles. So anytime, that helps you determine what's in scope and what's out of scope. It's kind of what, some people refer to as it's a sort of like a RACI model, like responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. Like who's doing what? This was our true north. So we put these guiding principles together every time we think about what strategy, what initiative, what are we trying to do? We go back to these guiding principles and make sure that we adhere to our true north. So you can see here, we wanted to identify as an employer of choice. When you want to attract a diverse group of people, of talent, you want to make sure that you are an employer of choice. You want to lead in driving and sustaining cultural growth, because you can attract a diverse amount of people to your organization, but they need to want to stay. They need to understand and be valued and respected, right? And then we wanted to make sure, because we are a utility, that all of our efforts support our customer, right? And then in our community, we want to strive for excellence. And then in the supplier diversity, as we talked about before, that's a place where we want to lead. We want to be able to support our community and our customers in the recovery as we move through a post-COVID community, and as we move, and kind of deal with the current racial unrest. So this is our actual strategy, and you can actually see on the side here where, it's the next part of how and what we did. So you can see here, this is what we decided. We broke it out. We have 5 pillars. Once we decided our guiding principles, we said, okay, now what we're going to do is break it out into 5 pillars so that we can share this with the organization, so that they can, as we cascade the message and the tone and all of the tools, where people can add value. So very first, workforce talent. We talked about that. How do we attract? How do we develop? How do we retain? The next part is workforce culture. We want to ensure that we have a culture, again, that is respectful and inclusive, and where people have the opportunity to belong, right? So again, you can see some of the things that we're working on here. And then customer. There's this thing called customer segmentation, where you understand the individual needs of a customer. And so we want to ensure and enhance the customer experience so that they feel like we hear them, we value their opinion, and that we're working towards their needs, and that we're going to support them as we can as part of the utility. And then again, in community, our customers are our community. We want to be reflective of the customers and the communities that we serve. So we want to be active, we want to be engaged, and we want to be involved. And again, you can see all of those things that we're working on. And then finally, our supplier diversity. We created a program, and it's part of a partnership with the New Pittsburgh Courier. And we are working to highlight Black-owned businesses and their contributions to our community. Again, this is just a snippet of the DLC strategy. There is another breakdown, just in terms of what we're doing and where we're going. For instance, Kay talked about earlier, and so did Patty, talked about some of the programs. We have a specific program that we work on. It's called the EDT program, and this is the community outreach, and it incorporates all the concepts that Patty talked about in terms of internship, in terms of training. We take people through the program, and then we hire them into life-changing roles as line workers. That in itself is the DLC strategy. We've talked a lot about how we got there, what you need to do to get there, and this is just a snapshot of the outcome. So I'll be looking forward to any questions you may have. I know it was short, but it was definitely sweet, and so thank you for your time, and I'm going to turn that over. Mike?
Well, thank you, Sarah, and we have one more question, poll question actually, before we get to taking your questions as attendees. And again, just type those in the question box there. So the last poll here is, what are the biggest barriers to achieving diversity within our companies? And we give you 5 choices, or all of the above. So we focus on here bias, leadership, culture, education, hiring practices. So what do you think is that biggest barrier to achieving what we're talking about today? I appreciate everyone jumping on that. You've jumped on that pretty quick this time, and we want to know how you feel about that. what do you think is the biggest barriers to achieving diversity within our companies? Obviously, our speakers today have pointed out several of those. Is there one that maybe jumps out a little bit more than the others for you? Looks like most of you have jumped on that. I'm going to go ahead and share the results. So, unconscious bias came out in terms of the individual reasons. Not real surprising there, to a big problem. Of course, some of you felt that it really was all of the above. So thank you again for your participation in the polls. And let's go ahead and take a look at some of the questions that have come in here. So the one question here came in from Eric, and he says, how do we make sure that the organizations who are rushing, and quote unquote, to do this work, make sure they don't forget about underrepresented communities and make sure that the employees don't get left behind? And he made the point that it's extremely important to move quickly, but also effectively. And would one of you like to comment on that, address that question?
Sure, I will. I'd love to hear Sarah's answer too, though. But that's a very good question, very important question. And I think one way to do it, well, there's a couple ways. An important way to do it is basic change management. So make sure that everyone in the organization knows what's happening, what the goals are, that they're educated effectively, that they're given a chance to weigh in on the process or participate in the process if they would like to. To make sure the employees aren't left behind means engaging them, educating them, listening to them, making them feel an important part of this process. And then I also think onboarding would be very important to make sure the new employees feel a part of the team and not tokenized or, marginalized maybe in a mostly white organization, and now Hispanics and women and people of color are joining, making sure they have effective onboarding and welcome. And that's done a lot of ways. It can be workshops, it can be monthly lunch and learns where everyone gets to sit together. And in terms of diversity of employees, employees should also be engaged to help with their ideas. How do we reach out? Why are we doing this? And if they're given the information why, and they're also allowed to participate and encouraged to participate, then I think it's effective and they don't feel left behind. But I'd really be curious to hear Sarah's thinking too.
Yeah, so Patty, I think you pretty much nailed it, especially around the change management piece, because that change management starts with education. One of the things that we did at Duquesne Light, to your point, is we introduced the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion. To your point, we did education around language. So what does that mean, right? And then one of the other things we talked about was, what's in it for me? Like, so what, you're doing this? So we defined the with them. And again, that was part of the change management plan. The other piece, and again, going back to the model that I shared, is just that sponsorship, right? Because we have high-level sponsorship. This is something that the company deems important. So yes, you can move pretty quickly, but you want to be mindful about your steps. And then from Patty's point, in terms of education, you want to engage. And one of the ways we were able to do that was we did pulse surveys. So I'm giving you some practical ways of actually doing that. We went out, we did pulse surveys, and that's pulse surveys are 5 quick questions. We gathered that data, and then we said, based on what you told us, right? And then we also made sure that diversity, sometimes when we talk about diversity, we always talk about minoritized or underrepresented groups. But diversity is a person who is unique in themselves. So it could be the way they learn, it could be the way they think, they speak, the way their physical appearances. It's all of those things, how they perceive things. And so we made sure that the term diversity was inclusive in itself, right? And we were very, very mindful of that, because one of the things you also want to create are allies. And allies are critical to the process. So again, I would go back to what Patty said, announce, educate, include, engage.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, too. Question came in here. This is particularly for you, Sarah. What steps have been completed to increase supplier diversity, and what segments were targeted at
Great
DSC?
question. Great question. Actually, we just recently launched our new supplier diversity program. And one of the things that we did was we hired a very skilled and experienced chief procurement officer. And we ensured that supplier diversity across the organization was known to have a critical component in the business. That's one of the things. And I'll go back to what Patty said earlier. We applied similar concepts to the supplier diversity strategy, right? We analyzed, we educated, and then we went out and we asked the community, what is it that we need to do better? And we got pretty good answers, and we acted on those answers, right? We just recently held our first supplier diversity summit. And in terms of targeting specific segments, we were very broad in terms of the diversity, but we also said, hey, by the way, you need to be certified to do business with DLC, right? Those are some of the critical things. So we specifically looked at veteran businesses, businesses owned by women and people of color. We looked at the businesses that were owned by people with disabilities, all of those certified areas. So we were very inclusive in our outreach and very targeted at the same time. Thank you.
Very good. Another question here. It says that one of the utility attendees says the community we serve is about 13% minority, and at my utility we have more minorities in our customer service areas and less in the operational areas. And so the question is, are the panel members seeing that in their companies as well? And if so, why do you think that is, and what strategies be employed to increase minority participation employment within the operational areas?
So I'll jump in here real quick. We do see similar trends, and we're working on those trends. Part of the reason for this, we feel, is that, you know, there's this thing called unconscious bias. So all of us have a perception of who belongs where, right? And so we have introduced different training programs to help people uncover and identify unconscious bias. Also, utilities have not been well known for, you know, doing real strong outreach. So I think that's the other piece of that. And so we've been actively engaged in outreach. The other thing is development, right? And I think Patty and Kay both talked about this. So developing and creating career paths for your employees. That's critical, because if people feel like they can grow and develop in an organization, they definitely will. So those are the kinds of things that we've been doing. We've had some high level of success doing that, and we've been able to move the needle. As my current CEO would say, you know, we're working on it, but we have more work to do.
Okay.
And I'll just jump in on that as well. And I couldn't agree more with the comments Sarah made. We, as a leadership advisory firm and search firm, we work with utilities that are interested to create more diversity in their organization. Again, not only, as Sarah pointed out, by becoming a talent magnet and being purposeful about developing a hiring and talent pipeline at all levels of the organization, but it's by creating those development paths. And for those high potential leaders in your organization, regardless of race or gender, having a proactive stance as leaders in the organization to create that, whether you call it a rotational or development opportunity for high potential diverse talent to gain more exposure In some cases, when we're working with a client that is specifically recruiting from outside, and they are obviously interested in meeting a diverse slate of candidates, but have placed a high priority on diversity for the role, we also often encourage the hiring leaders to really think broadly about their ability to develop someone, and perhaps give a leader who would in other cases be considered a bit of a step up, who has to grow into the role, as a way to increase the pipeline, which then increases the visibility, creates role models for others in the organization, and starts to build that pipeline underneath. It's a purposeful roadmap, as Sara pointed out, and as Patty identified in her example. It's an intentional process.
Okay. Well, we have just a minute or two left here. Another question here is directed at you, Patty. SECC conducted that study, Understanding Lower Income Consumers in the Smart Energy Future. What really prompted that study? How did this come about? What was the driving force behind needing to do that study?
Right. So our mission is to understand consumers in the energy space, and is very difficult to reach, especially for utilities or for consultancies and consumer advocates who want to help them or create programs for them. And so every fall, our members have a members meeting, and we have a subcommittee, or a breakout group, I guess, that talks about what research does the industry need about consumers that we don't already have, and that could answer a lot of questions. And so we come up with the idea about data analytics or segmentation. We did a study on rate design, et cetera. And low-income consumers is always an important group. This is our third one. We don't do them every year because it's an expensive group to reach. It's difficult, which makes it expensive. And we just got lucky that we happened to be doing the study this year when there was a pandemic. And so we hadn't finished the survey instrument before the pandemic came. So we asked that constituent a lot of questions around, is your utility helping you? What sorts of help do you need? Do you feel more at risk for food worry and utility bill worry and mortgage worry, and how are you prioritizing your financial needs? So we were able to ask a lot of questions. We just didn't ask them broken out by any kind of racial segmentation until, so when everything happened this summer, then we decided to go back and relook at the data from a racial component, and that's what we'll be publishing in January. But Great. It's just part of to understand all consumers, and that's one important group.
Super. Well, thank you for that insight. So we come to the end here today. As Brian stated at the beginning, diversity, equity, and inclusion is critical for energy utilities and their partners, not only as employers, but also in the way we serve and represent our customers. And Patty, Kay, and Sara, you did a great job today, taking us on a journey through what the research tells us, the best practices of DEI, and what it takes to achieve DEI in the real world, moving beyond discussion and into really taking action. So we hope that you as attendees can take at least one idea you gleaned today and move your company forward in its need to provide more diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thank you again to our excellent speakers. Thank you also for taking time to join us today. You as attendees, check your email inbox for an invite to the next Thought Leadership webinar in January on how to market paperless billing to customers. And we look forward to seeing you there. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Maureen for some closing comments.
Thanks, Mike. And I would like to thank all of you again for attending our webinar today. As a reminder, the presentation materials and the playback link to the recording of today's webinar will be emailed to you within the next couple of days. Should you have additional questions or feedback, please don't hesitate to contact us. Also, as Mike mentioned, keep Thursday, January 21st open for our next webinar on how to market paperless billing to customers. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.